Hello everybody, what's going on? My name is Kador, and today we're going to be looking at the second album from deadmau5, Vexillology. And I looked it up, and that means the study of flags. That word, deadmau5's naming scheme is very weird sometimes. This album is very different from the previous album, Get Scraped, in that there's a lot less experimentation. He kind of started to develop a foundation in a certain genre, which is house. And for this album, it is specifically tech house, which is a genre that is, I guess, basically defined as a simple house beat with some extra percussion and stuff that happens throughout, as well as a bunch of different sounds and samples that are kind of spattered throughout to make it interesting, but no real melody for the most part, and that couldn't be more true of this album. It's generally regarded as deadmau5's worst album, and I agree with that. It's just, the tracks are pretty boring for the most part. There's not really much progression that happens during them, and there really isn't a melody for most of them. But I'll kind of show some examples of what I'm talking about when we go through track by track right now. So the first track on the album is 1981, which it just starts out with a generic kind of house beat. Some extra stuff is added on as it goes. There's no real melody in this song, but there are some sort of melodic components here and there. You'll get some samples of some just sort of interesting synth work that have maybe a couple notes every few measures. And then eventually, sort of when the beat cuts out a little bit and gets kind of quieter, you hear this sort of filtered robotic voice going 1981. There's maybe like 3 or 4 sounds that kind of reappear throughout the song. It's not super interesting, but it's at least a little bit melodic, and it's interesting enough to get 5 out of 10 in my opinion. Next up is Bounce, which you can immediately tell has this very distinctive kind of, I don't know how to describe it, almost like a Velcro sound maybe? It's just like a kind of thing that goes throughout. No melody at all in this song, and there's really no progression at all either. There's nothing that really happens throughout. There's an occasional voice sample that says, "dig this," which is actually from one of his previous songs they did like super early on, and he kind of transferred to this one. But there's just not really anything that happens during this track that makes it interesting at all. If you've heard like the first 30 seconds or so, you've kind of heard the whole song. I'm gonna have to give this like a 3 out of 10. It's just not that good. Next is Dr. Funkenstein. This seems to be maybe a little bit of a favorite of this album for some reason, just considering that it has like 10 remixes. But I don't know, I guess a lot of people at this record company remix a lot of these tracks. But anyway, Dr. Funkenstein is sort of a bass-heavy track that has maybe a little bit of a melody in the bass line, but not really anything super interesting, or it doesn't really stand out at all. And you have this voice sample saying Dr. Funkenstein every now and then, although I feel like it appears maybe like twice as often as it should, and so it gets really annoying towards the end, and it's a little bit too long, and not enough really happens during it, so I'm going to give it a 4 out of 10. The next one is a actually very interesting song. It's called Fustercluck. Basically, this song, it starts with the, house beat like all the rest of them do. But it gets these really weird sounds as you start listening to it. These sort of like almost cluck sounds, I guess, like a chicken or something. And these sort of like weird shaker sounds that are very interesting. And what stands out most about this song is there's this weird vocal sample that appears partway through that's just very like chopped up, glitchy, and it's just like some lady saying something, I don't really know what. It's like, yeah, okay, this is a good one. Do you even have a computer? I don't know, those are the only lines I can make out. So I don't know what the voice sample is from, but it is very interesting. There's a lot of weird sounds that appear throughout, and the vocal sample keeps it pretty like engaging. So I'll go with a 6 out of 10 for this one, just for creativity. Next up is Lay, or Lie, or something. I'm going to call it Lay. This track is probably the most melodic that you hear so far on this album, if you're hearing it in the order that is presented. Although it doesn't start that way, it starts pretty boring, and there's not really anything that happens except for this like wah kind of sound in the beginning. And like after a few minutes of the song, it finally kind of breaks down. You get this cool like background radio sample type thing, and you get some just sort of like background droning synth pad kind of thing that comes in, as well as a little bit of a melody. It's pretty repetitive, but it sounds pretty good, all things considered. And the rest of the song is pretty melodic, but nothing else really happens. Although, yeah, I mean, the melody is like pretty good and actually has a melody unlike the other ones, so I'll give it a 7 out of 10. Next up is Orca, which actually has a melody throughout the whole thing, but it's just like a sequence of 4 notes over and over again throughout the whole thing, and it doesn't really change at all. There's maybe like one other synth that comes on at some point, and the sort of like character of the sound kind of gradually changes throughout, which is okay. But the really main problem that I have with this song is just its length. It's like 8 minutes and 30 seconds. It's just way too long, and there's not enough that happens during it to satisfy that amount. That being said, though, it is a pretty good melody, repetitive as it is, and it does sound pretty nice, so I'll give it a 7 out of 10 again. And after that is Plus, which honestly is probably my least favorite on the album, directly following probably my favorite. I don't even know what to say about it. Like, there's this weird kind of like bassy pluck sound that happens just throughout the whole thing, but it's very like atonal. You can't really, like, there's no melody or anything that happens, and there's not really any progression that happens during the song either. There's like some unintelligible voice sample at some point saying something, I don't know what, and there's a few extra little sounds here and there, but it's really just kind of a bass heavy beat, and that's all. I guess if you put it in the context of being in the genre of minimal techno, it's okay, just for kind of listening in the background maybe, but there are so many better examples of minimal techno that I don't know. I don't really like this one. I'm going to give it a 3 out of 10. Next up is Apply Overnight. The only real characteristic thing about this track is the sort of chopped up, auto-tuned vocal sounds that happen throughout, and they're in a pretty nice melodic pattern, but they're a bit too like infrequent to actually be considered like a melody, and there's not really anything else that happens during this track. The vocal samples do make it sound a little bit more light than maybe the rest of the songs on this album, but yeah, other than that, there's not much else to say about it. 4 out of 10. The next song is TL7, which is kind of a weird one. It's the shortest one on the album at about 4.5 minutes, and it's just kind of, you know, a house beat with a few extra drum sounds here and there. And the only other thing that happens during it is this very strange sound that is kind of hard to describe. Maybe like hitting a soda can with like a baseball bat or something. I don't know. It's just this sort of like weird, slightly like grimy, kind of like "pah" sound. Again, it's too infrequent and atonal to be considered a melody at all. It's an interesting sound, but there's nothing really else that happens. I'll give it a 4 out of 10. And finally, the closing track to this disappointing album is Trepid. This track starts out just like any other one on this album, but the thing that stands out about this one is partway through it starts to get kind of like jungle-ish almost. You hear these sort of like tropical drums that sort of come in at one point. That's the only way I can really describe it. So you just kind of get this cool beat percussion thing that just sounds sort of like a jungle song, I guess, for lack of a better word. The problem with the song, though, is that that's really all it is. It really is just a beat. Unlike Plus, it's a much more interesting beat and is much more enjoyable to listen to, ultimately, but like it's just a beat, so I can't really say anything else about it. There's almost no other sounds that really pull it together in any way. It's not the worst, but I'm gonna give it a 5 out of 10. Alright, so that was all the tracks on this album, but as far as the album composition as a whole, how well the tracks work together and how they fit together, that's probably the best thing about this album. The tracks all fit together pretty darn well, because they all have the same kind of beat, the same BPM, so they can be easily mixed together, and they all sound pretty much like they work together, so I'll give that section a 9 out of 10. So with all those scores being averaged together, we get the final grade for deadmau5's Vexillology album to be a 5.2 out of 10. Definitely his worst album in my opinion, and I think in most people's opinions, but it was where he started doing house all the time as his sort of main genre, and I think this album sort of paved the way for making actual interesting house tracks in his next album, which I think is pretty fantastic, Random Album Title, and I'll be reviewing that next, so stay tuned for that. See ya!